You already know what it is. Myself, Unefa Axel, aka Omega Axel, back once again putting in the ancestors' work. What's good? Wagwan. What's going down for the live and locked in fam? First thing I have to say, as always, is peace and more powers and a big black African heart-filled thank you to each and every single one of the Patreons. You already know if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be here right now kicking the intel. So more powers to you. Today's presentation is one that I have been meaning to record for probably the last 6, 7, 8 weeks, because we've been doing little snippets of it on the live streams. But this is Moorish Europe, the Renaissance and the Reconquista. So I don't want to waste too much of your time. We're going to get it in. But as always, before we start with the actual presentation, if you don't promote yourself, how can you expect anybody else to promote you? So most of you will already know the new book is out, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. It's available from ancestorswork.com. You can also find it online on Amazon. But for those who don't know, it is a short crash course to understanding black excellence throughout history. Okay, the black African contribution to world progression, world evolution, in academics, medicine, okay, in science, in literacy, okay, in leadership, all of these different things, all of the areas that black people just naturally excel in, documented it. And it is a tribute to the person who originated the concept, Joel Augustus Rogers, the Jamaican born historian and street knowledge kicker, okay, the spark behind the Harlem Renaissance. He came with the idea in 1934, and I read his work and realized how powerful and important it was, and I decided that our people today in 2018 and 2017, when I wrote it, needed to be reacquainted. He needed, and the work needed to be put back to the forefront of the mind. But anyway, it's not just 100 amazing facts about the Negro, okay? It comes with additional reading lists, it comes with quizzes, it comes with lesson plans. So for parents who homeschool or parents who have a lot to do with their kids' education, you're going to benefit from the work because it's going to allow you to help develop their critical thought. But anyway, that's by the by. Go and support the work. It's £10, okay? 50% of the profits are being donated to the We Will Rise Together project, a project which you can actually physically see the benefits of the donations. Okay, so far there's been a school that has been refurbished or partly refurbished. We built a pool in there so the kids are now able to learn how to swim and obviously cool down part. Go onto the internet, go onto Instagram, search for the hashtag We Will Rise Together, and you will see the benefits that you're contributing to. But anyway, without any further ado, like I said, this is Black or Moorish Europe, the Renaissance and the Reconquista. Now again, those of you who have been in any of the live streams or have been to any of my live events, you already don't know that I believe in immortality. Okay, I believe that that's not a pseudo concept. Yeah, no matter how many people are gonna try to tell you YOLO, you only live once, the reality of the situation is the soul is energy. Energy never dies. Energy simply transfers. Alright? Okay, and you are not your body. You are a soul with a body. Alright? But ultimately the concept of immortality it's something that we can all attain. Okay? It has worked for the likes of Jesus, or if you want to call him Yeshua. Yeah, it's worked for Allah, it's worked for the Buddha, it's worked for Shiva, Krishna, all of these different deities, whether you subscribe to them being real or not. They remain alive today because they remain in the hearts and the minds of the people who continue to speak their name and to read their works and to talk about them. So if it can work for all of these people and these characters of history, which we, can't really see too much benefit to the peoples then, why is it that it can't work for our ancestors, the one that we can provably see have been laying down the foundation for us, the ones who've carved out a space for us in this world, the ones who have provided us with the legacy for us to pick the reins up of so that we can continue building on, okay, and continue to raise this African nation. So I hope wherever you're watching this, you feel comfortable enough to shout out after you hear one of the ancestors' names, Ashe. Ashe means and so it was, or and so it was said in the West African language of the Akan people. Okay, so we're gonna start with Dr. Joseph Ben Yochanan, Ashe. Dr. Asa G. Hilliard, Shea, Malik El Shabazz, aka by any means Malcolm X, Shea. We got Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Shea, Martin Luther King Jr., Shea, Dr. John Henrik Clark, Shea, the Most Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, Shea, Dr. Chancellor Williams, Shea, Dr. Sheikh Anta Dia, Shea, the father of Black History Month, which is coincidental because today is the 1st of February, which means in the USA today is the first day of Black History Month. Carter G. Woodson, Shea, Joel Augustus Rogers, Shea, Alfonso Bowman, aka the Healer of the Nation, Dr. Sabi, Shea, the powerhouse sister Dr. Frances Cress Wilson, Shea, the author of Stolen Legacy George G.M. James, Shea, Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad, Shea, Ya Asante Wa, Shea, Robert Nesta Marley, Shea, the Ahosi Warriors, Shea, Thomas Sankara, Shea, Amina the Warrior Queen of Zazu, Shea, Steve Biko, Shea, Kwame Nkrumah, Shea, Duty Bookman, Shea, Queen Tai, Shea, Toussaint L'Ouverture, Shea, Patrice Lumumba, Shea, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Shea. Of course, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who could have been added to this list for us to pay respects to, but for me personally, these are some of the people that I consider to be heroes. So I hope that you took part, because these are some of the works, these are some of the peoples who we draw upon, but this very information that we're going to be kicking it in with today. So, the mission objective. Okay, today we're going to be covering about 800 years that Dr. Ivan Van Sertima called the Golden Age of the Moors. Okay, and it starts with the military general Tariq ibn Zayed, and we're going to go all the way through the different caliphates that actually controlled what was known to be called Al-Andalus. We're also going to touch on the various different influences through things like education, science, architecture, religion, all of these different things that North Africa had on Europe, which are still visible today. We're going to talk about the Reconquista, which was a period of time when the Europeans galvanized themselves, had like a form of kind of nationalism, and they seek to ethnically cleanse Hispaniola. We're also going to take a look at some of the individual figures which pop up and have marked the pages of history during what we consider to be the Golden Age of the Moors. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be oversimplified, very simply because 700 to 800 years worth of history is a lot to cover. Okay, people that we're going to be talking about, and some of the kind of events, some of the decrees, the political movements, the agendas, all of these different kind of things that happen, they warrant their own historical breakdown. And because we only have, you know, a little bit of time here today, we're just going to skip over them. Well, not skip over them, we're just going to break them down so we understand the importance of them, and you then have the ability to go and do some additional research. So where are we at then? So first and foremost, okay, the story of the Moors in Europe, okay, actually doesn't begin with Tariq ibn Zayed. It doesn't actually directly begin with the Moors. Okay, so what you need to do is cast your mind to 7th century Spain. At this period of time, 7th century Spain, it was currently under the rule of a Germanic, tyrannical Christian Visigoth called Roderick, and he was imposing his ideology and his agenda on Hispaniola. Now, in Spain, there was also a nobleman called Julian who was required to send his daughter to the royal house to be educated, and I believe she was there on some type of kind of like ambassadorial duties. Now, whilst she was in the royal house, she was raped by Roderick. Now, naturally, as a father, Julian was enraged. He vowed to bring the end of Visigoth rule in Hispaniola. So what he did is he promptly travelled to North Africa, where he met with the Moors, okay, and he began to tell the Moors just how vulnerable and how weak Spain or Hispaniola was. And basically Julian made an agreement with the Moors, with a person called Musa bin Nayasa, or Nayasa. I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, but Musa bin Nayasa was Tariq ibn Ziyad's commanding officer, and there was an agreement made between Julian and Nayasa to help bring the Moors over, because Julian owned a lot of vessels and a lot of ships and a few ports, so he could do it discreetly. Now, it's said that Tariq's army was comprised of around no more than 11,000 men versus Roderick's documented 100,000 men, and Tariq delivered a crushing defeat that actually took the life of Roderick in that battle, which was a battle called Guadalete, and that happened on June 19th, 711 CE. Okay, it's a big historically or well-known historical fact that Tariq ibn Ziyad, this ex-Negro slave, this commanding general, came through and kicked Roderick's clout. But little is known about Tariq ibn Ziyad's earlier life. Okay, the earliest references that we have to him in history is by an Arab geographer called Al-Adrisi. General history accepts the fact that he is an Arabized African from Tripolina, which is today Algeria. The Berber groups which are kind of claiming Tariq ibn Ziyad's legacy ancestrally are the Zanata, the Walhalas, and the Nafsa. People in conversation have actually genuinely tried to argue about what the ethnicity of the Moors were, and the reality of the situation is that the Moors were not one nationality, they were not one ethnicity. There were multiple different types of Moors. There were African Moors, there were Arab Moors, and there was also what would be called I suppose Zambo or Sambo Moors, which was Arab and African mixed. Okay, the Moorish rule in Spain is regularly called a kingdom or an empire, and I always like to kind of nip that in the bud, because in reality, at different times and at different periods, there were different rulers or different caliphates in charge, and they ruled differently. They had different agendas, they had different beliefs, and they didn't all necessarily get along. So it wasn't necessarily a kingdom. Just as an example for that, there was the Umayyads, there were the Abbasids, the Ayyubids, the Fatimids, there was the Cordoba Caliphate. So there was all of these different caliphates, and they worked, sometimes they worked together, mainly they worked against each other. When we're talking about Hispaniola and the Caliphates in there, like I said, we had the Western Caliphates. They were heavily involved in recruiting from west and central regions of Africa. So I just want to make it abundantly clear, when we're talking about the Moors in Spain and the actual kingdoms and rulerships in Spain, and the people who were populating these, ranks, because they were recruited from Central and West Africa, you can pretty much guess where I'm going with this. They were black African people. Okay, what else we got about? Oh, okay, so this is always very interesting. I always drop this one in there because we have to pay tribute as much as we possibly can to the late elder Joel Augustus Rogers. In his original works in 1934, in fact 74, Joel Augustus Rogers brings to everybody's attention that the Rock of Gibraltar, the symbol of stability, is actually named after Tariq ibn Ziyad, and the word Gibraltar is a corruption of the word Gebral Tariq, which means the mountain of Tariq, and he was the Moor who captured the rock, which was previously called Caliphates. And he also goes on with the proof to state that there are two great coloured figures of history in Islam, one of them being Bilal, the freedom, the freer of the slaves, which is something we will get into in later presentations, and of course Tariq ibn Ziyad. But Tariq ibn Ziyad, as you can see there in the middle, is recognised by history. This is not, we're not making this up, this isn't Afrocentrist, trying to blackenize the world. Like, this is real talk. This is found on the Gibraltar Note, yeah. They probably could have put a bit more respect on his name and give him maybe a £50 note, not a £5 note. You see it? So basically, real quick, just before I forget, Tariq acted as a vassal on behalf of the Umayyad Caliphate. His name was Al-Walid I, up until around 714 CE, until he was ordered to return back to Damascus. And we don't actually hear much about him, or in fact anything about him in history after that. And it's thought that he died around 720 CE. But the next stage in the kind of Moorish takeover of Al-Andalus happened in two parts that stretched over one period of time, and it was the Emir, or the Emirate, and the Caliphate of Cordoba. Now, after the Umayyad conquest of Hispaniola, the Iberian Peninsula was established as a vassal state under the control of the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, in 756 CE, Abd Ali-Rahman I, who was a prince of the deposed Umayyad royal family, refused to recognize the authority of the Abbasid Caliphate, who were now rising in control and in power. And he declared himself the Emir of Cordoba and kind of declared himself independent. Now, this independent state wouldn't have its first unification in Al-Andalus for over 25 years, and that unification consisted of Toledo, Zaragoza, Pamplona, and Barcelona. Now, later on down the line, Abd al-Rahman III, who proclaimed himself the Caliph of Cordoba, which stands for the ruler of the Islamic world, because he declared that Cordoba was now an elite Islamic center of the world. He actually ascended to the throne in his early 20s and reigned for around half a century, and he actually made himself into the most powerful prince of Iberia. Now, Abd al-Rahman was a patron of the arts, especially building, so architecture was his thing. A third of the revenue that he generated, he actually kept for ordinary kind of government expenses. A third was hoarded, and a third was actually spent on building. Okay, it was said that Cordoba contained over 3,000 mosques, over 100,000 shops, and there was multiple homes built during his reign. Now, the next stage in the conquest was the Almoravids. Okay, the Almoravids ran from 1040 CE all the way up to 1147 CE. Now, the Almoravids were a Berber Muslim dynasty which originated among or in between the Latuma or the Lamtuma and the Gudula, and they were nomadic groups of the Sahara, and they traversed, traded, and recruited in the territory between the Nadra, the Niger, and the Senegal rivers. Okay, now their capital was an area called Marrakesh, which of course we all know, and it was a city which the Almoravids established in 1062 CE, and their kingdom stretched from over the western Maghreb all the way up to Al-Andalus. Okay, and it was founded, or the Almoravid was founded by somebody called Abdallah ibn Yassin, and he was previously unsuccessful in spreading his Maliki interpretation and application of Islam, and he decided to retreat to an island just off Senegal with a growing number of kind of companions and followers who believed in his kind of Maliki thought. Now, eventually he grew so large in numbers that he was able to actually go back to the regions which had previously rejected him and actually take them over. One thing that I just want to point out as well is, remember, the fact that the majority of the people who were filling the ranks of these large armies, especially the Almoravids at this period of time, because they were recruiting from areas like Senegal, Niger, Chad, yeah, the Sahara regions, these are some of the blackest areas in the world. Okay, so you can almost bet your bottom dollar that because these armies were filled with these black African people who were going up into Al-Andalus, that they were taking their blackness with them. What, do you think they just left it in Africa? Arab scholars, okay, such as Ibn Khaldun, suggest that the Almoravids' attacks on Ouagadougou, which is ancient Ghana, were actually instrumental in breaking up the kingdom. Okay, because if you take note, around 1000 CE or AD, however you look at it, Ghana begins to disintegrate, and all of these, various ranging chieftaincies become broken up, and many of them assimilate with these Muslim Berber tribes, and many of them go on to form the Malayan kingdom. But again, that's like a different presentation. A great book for that, by the way, would be Exiled Egyptians by somebody called Mustafa Gadala. Now, the rule of the Almoravids was put to an end by the Almohads, who had been eating away at their kingdom and eventually took Marrakesh in 1147. But we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But an interesting point to mention at this point, as I said before we move on, is that the Moorish Empire or the Moorish Kingdom shouldn't really be considered a Moorish Empire or a Moorish Kingdom, because as we stated, at different times there were different Caliphates in charge who had different agendas, different beliefs, different methods of rule, and in all actual fact the Almoravids were actually seen by other sects of Muslimdom as an offense to the religion. Okay, this offense to the religion ultimately was what ended up being the downfall and the impetus to the rise up against the Almoravids. So as I said, the Almoravids end came in 1147 when they lost their capital, Marrakesh, and they lost that to the Almohads. Now, the major group that opposed the Almoravids were the Almohads or the Almohadin, okay, meaning the unifiers. They were founded by somebody called Abu Abd Allah Muhammad ibn Tumar, who was a Moroccan-born Quranic student of Cordoba, who began a campaign for religious reforms, which eventually picked up enough steam for him to take over the Maghreb and Al-Andalus. Okay, so spiritual warfare is serious. Now, the narrative goes, okay, that once he'd become educated, Ibn Tumar began practicing and preaching his religion the very same way very excited vegans do when they first go plant-based. Okay, he got up in everybody's face that he crossed paths with. He mocked and mimicked the veiling of men and the unveiling of women. He poured wine away, tipped people's jars over, because of course wine and alcohol would be haram. He incited boycotts, riots, and he basically just created disorder wherever he went. Okay, and eventually he gained such a reputation that authorities in different towns and cities just simply banished him. Now, he was eventually joined by some two people called one called Abu Bakr and another called Al-Mamun. Al-Mamun, to me personally, is one of the baddest Moors that ever existed. He was a real life, living, breathing goat, greatest of all time. But Abu Bakr and Al-Mamun were his chief strategist and his army commander respectively. And oh my eye. Ultimately, the Almoravids were kind of like the saviors to the people, to the Moors who were already up in Al-Andalus. But before we even get to that, let me tell you this. Ibn Tumar had become such a problem. There was this one time that he actually bumped into an Almoravid king in a mosque, and he mocked the king, and the king actually sentenced him to 14 lashes of the whip, and he exiled him. And it was that exile there, that whipping, that really kind of changed the dynamics of what Ibn Tumar wanted to do. Upon his obviously excommunication, he left. He went to a place called Tinmel in the Atlas Mountains, and he built a ribat, which is basically an impregnable fortress. Okay, and that became the headquarters for the Almohad rebellion. And after a little bit of time, the Almohads thought that they could take the Almoravids, so they came down from their mountain, attempted to take Marrakesh, and they actually got battered. They got crushed. Okay, they had to retreat back to the mountains, and it actually claimed the life of Ibn Tumar. So after about a decade or so, with lots of power struggles as to who should take over the Almohads, Al-Mamun stepped up to the plate. He proved himself to be the righteous leader. He, was the man for the job, and he came down in 1147 with his armies, and he crushed the Almoravids at Marrakesh, and he took them. Okay, he then later, in fact, hold on, let me just show you this. Oh, so it was actually, sorry, should I say, it was under the leadership of Al-Mamun, arguably, as I said, one of the greatest Moors that the Almohads had. He took Marrakesh in 1147 and he went on up into Al-Andalus, and he actually turned his attention to the Christians because the Christians were giving the Moors in Europe a problem. So he was like, F this, let me deal with these and kind of push you right back up into their duchy areas, you know, or Gaul, whatever they called it at this period of time. The Nasrid, okay, were also a caliphate or a group of people which coexisted alongside the Almohads and eventually became suffocated by the uprisings of the Christians in the Reconquista, leaving the Kingdom of Granada to be the last African kingdom. But we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So ultimately, yeah, Al Mamun came up and he just kept delivering defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat to the Christians. Okay, but eventually, of course, every flower comes to the end of its blossom, and of course, the Almohads were defeated. And they were actually defeated because of inter-disputes, a crabs in a barrel type situation. Okay, the caliphate was, or the caliphate was split up into, you know, multiple divisions that actually worked against each other and snaked each other, and at some point even worked with the Europeans to obviously, you know, beat their brothers. But the Almohad Caliphate came to an end eventually in 1212 in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. And as I stated, sorry, that kind of left the Kingdom of Granada to be the last African stronghold in Europe. But I just want to go back. This was the Ribat in Tinmel, which has a mosque on there now, and it was built in honor of Abu Abd Allah Muhammad ibn Tumar, who was the founder, of course, of the Almohads. So, the Reconquista. Okay, now mainstream scholars suggest that the Reconquista began the moment that Tariq ibn Zayed landed in Gibraltar. It refers to the European fight to reclaim the land that lasted a roller coaster near 800 years, and it led up to the colonial regime that came to be the Age of Discovery. Now, essentially, this period was a series of attacks that were led from the north, where the Moors pushed them back to, over time winning the land back through European coalition. So basically, you know, the Crusades was part of this. I mean, we're going to break it down now anyway. Let me just show you this though. This is something called Battaglia de Poitiers, and it's a scene of the if I could speak, it is a scene of the Reconquista. So look, we've got the Moors. And then we have the Europeans. All right, then let's quickly run through a timeline of the Reconquista. So as we discussed, the Reconquista was, you know, the period of time when the Europeans kind of galvanized themselves under this kind of European Christian nationalism, and they set out to ethnically cleanse Hispaniola, kick out all Moorish trace as much as they possibly could out of Europe. So this officially began in 711 as Tariq ibn Zayed and the first band of Moors actually landed in Hispaniola. You know, that's what scholars say. But the first official battle, you know, that we're going to recognize happened in 718, which was the Battle of Covadonga, which was followed by the creation of an independent Christian state in the mountains of the northwest region of the Iberian Peninsula, which actually grew to be the Kingdom of Osteris, which happens to be Austria. And this happened to become the kind of headquarters of the resistance, or the Christian resistance against the Muslim takeover of Hispaniola. Next is in 721. Okay, the Moors were turned back from France. They lost a battle in Toulouse. Okay, it was the Aquitanian Christian-led army. It was led by Duke Odo of Aquitaine, and he defeated the Umayyad Muslim army who were trying to besiege Toulouse. Next, in 791, Alfonso II repopulated parts of Galicia, Leon, and Castile, and he incorporated them under the Kingdom of Austria, which we already discussed, become like the stronghold for like the Christian resistance. From 930 to 950, King Romario II, who was an excellent military commander, actually expanded remarkably from the north into Salamanca, Ledesma, and also founded and repopulated the frontier strongholds. Now, Romario actually masterminded the defeat of a joint Andalusian offense at what was called, I believe, the Battle of Simancas, which was in 939. What else do we have? We have the Duchy of Castile is established as an independent Christian state. Okay, so throughout this period, the Castilian kings made extensive conquests into the southern Iberian areas at the expense of the Islamic expansion. Castile and Leon, with their sovereignly acquisitions, came to be known as the Crown of Castile. Next, in 1086, we have the Battle of Zalaca. Okay, this was a battle between the Almoravid army led by the Almoravid king Yusuf ibn Tushfin, and he led the army against the Castilian king Alfonso V or Alfonso VI, and this battleground actually later went on to be called Az-Zalaca, which in English means slippery ground, because the warriors were actually slipping all over the ground due to the tremendous amount of blood that was actually shed on the day. Now, I think, if I remember correctly, this is actually the battle that the Almoravids were actually saved by the Almohads. Okay, Al-Mamun came up, you know, who we were talking about earlier. He came up and he actually helped the Almoravids at this period of time. But after that, of course, he assimilated all of the the Almoravid kingdoms. Next, okay, in 1094, during the Second Crusade, El Cid, the legendary kind of national hero of Spain, helped the Portuguese retake Lisbon, and he helped retake Lisbon, and he took back control of the city of Valencia in 1094. Next, okay, we have in 1143, Portugal is established as an independent state. It was like the baby of Leon and Castile and was under Christian rule and essentially had a very diverse population at this period of time. Next, in 1309, okay, is it Fernando or is it Ferdinand, sorry. Ferdinand won back control of Gibraltar over a period of time. I think they began in 1333. He actually won. He had 3 battles. The first, he actually rigged the Moors or kicked the Moors out of Gibraltar, and then he repelled 2 more attacks from the Moors. Next, which is quite a considerable date, is 1452. This was when Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull, the Dom de Verses. Okay, this is where, you know, as if it wasn't clear already, the Christian house, so to speak, picked its side when it comes to kind of race and ethnicity and this and that, because the Dom de Verses actually granted Alfonso V the right to reduce Saracens, pagans, and any other non-believers or unbelievers to hereditary slavery. Now, this was reaffirmed in something else which was called the Romanus Pontificat, which was another papal bull of 1455, which was also written and signed by Pope Nicholas V. And these papal bulls actually came to be the reasons for the justification to rationalize and accept and marginalize Black African people. So that was kind of like the justification for their mistreatment. So I'll just quickly read the segment of the papal bull which kind of gives us that. It says, "We grant you," so we being the Vatican, "we grant you you being the kings of Portugal and Spain. By these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens, pagans, and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and any other property, and to reduce their persons to perpetual servitude. So, as we said, this served as both a foundation and further helped radicalize their methods of actually removing the Moor from Europe, and also fueled, was fuel to the fire for the so-called Age of Discovery. The Dom de Verses, I would also like to point out, were further elucidated in a latter book called the Inter Cateria, or Cateria. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that was in 1456. And this expounded basically the importance of supporting a Christian army, and it also reiterated Portugal's holy claim to West Africa. But now let's talk about two other key figures in the Reconquista, Ferdinand and Isabella, because, they played a significant role. So, just before we do touch on to Isabella and Ferdinand real quick, already kind of mentioned that the Christian kingdom was quite keen on getting involved in the resistance of the Moors from the time that the Crusaders kind of passed through the area. But I guess a good point to mention at this point is that race relations, so to speak, at this point were not as simple as black and white, as it is always kind of oversimplified and presented to us. We must not forget, and we cannot ignore, for the fact that over, say, about 600 to 700 years, there's been a high level of intermixing, to the point where some of the Christian resistance were even more. So remember, Moor as a term is just descriptive of a physical feature. It doesn't describe kind of where you're from or what religion you follow, for example. So the problem was not so much a racial issue. It was heavily propagated mainly by religious rhetoric, than it was ethnicity than race. Okay, so a black African or mixed black African Christian living in, say, Cordoba or Seville would have been, societally speaking, having or had more hierarchy than say a white European who was Jewish or converted to Islam. Okay, it was very much religious driven. So the 1300s and the 1400s had a kind of similar feel to today's current political sphere, I'd like to say, albeit, we know that colour has a very big part in it today. But it was mainly religious driven back then, okay? And since Rome was the kind of principal power and primarily in charge of writing the history, okay, they had the ability to edit out what didn't fit or suit or kind of fall in line with their current narrative and agenda. But anyway, Ferdinand and Isabella, okay? Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon were actually second cousins, okay? They were both descended of John I of Castile, and they were both from the house of Trastamara, and the Pope Sixtus IV or Fifth, I can't remember which one, actually signed a papal giving them kind of sacred allowance, which kind of allowed them to overlook their incest. But the unification between them earned them the title the Catholic monarchs by Pope Alexander IV or the Fifth, again I can't remember which one it was, and it was because they fought together to obviously re-establish and defend the Holy Kingdom in Al-Andalus, which their unification ultimately became the founding of modern Spain. So I guess kind of from a European perspective, that was a very important date for them. So another good point to mention is, although that these two kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, although they were kind of unified by marriage, the kingdoms did not operate kind of as one for a very long time. They operated separately. They both experienced various different kind of civil uprisings, disputes, revolts, and they actually eventually grew through 2 decades of all of this and become very, very strong. We actually even start to see the tactics which were later on applied during what's called, obviously, the Age of Discovery, being employed by the Spanish at this period of time to actually divide and conquer the various different Moorish kingdoms which were still in place at their time. As the Catholic monarchs, okay, their goal was to obviously conquer and remove all Muslim rulers, their influence and their trace from the land. And the most notable events of all was probably the Grenada War, the expulsion of the Moriscos, and the Inquisition, all of which then led on to the Age of Discovery. But the Grenada War, unlike what a lot of people are led to believe, was actually a joint task force, and it lasted over a decade, and it obviously did bring about the end of Muslim rule in Spain, and all of the Muslim land or Moorish land kind of fell under Castile rule. As I said, it wasn't kind of one straight all-out war, okay? It was the first time, as I said, Spanish applied any real kind of effective tactics in battle and were really intelligent about it. They would actually strike during the warmer months, so through summer, spring, and autumn, and then they would actually break during winter, leaving Granada kind of heavily damaged. They would be leaving them, trying to recover from external damages, and also trying to deal with internal conflict as well, because of course all of this pressure from invading nations and invading people creates a tension between the ranks. And eventually, after 10 years, okay, in 1492, the Moorish king of Granada, Boabdil, he conceded and actually handed over the keys to Granada and the keys to the Alhambra Palace to Ferdinand and Isabella. And let me just actually show you that image there so you can see it. Okay, Boabdil there upon the left on his black stallion, and he goes and he hands the keys to Ferdinand the pagan and Isabella the pagan, the incestuous ones. Okay, in fact, let me just get a little zoom in on some of the characters that we can see. I hope my head top isn't in the way. Let me move them up to the top there. Yeah, you see him there? Look at them pagan. So what else do I need to tell you real quick? What else? At the fall of the kingdom, there was something called the Treaty of Granada signed, which was created and was supposed to support the same type of religious tolerance that the Moors afforded to the Europeans and non-Moors. And for a time it worked, okay, but it didn't quite work for the Jews. The Christians were very, very on top of the Jews, and literally just after 3 months after the Alhambra Decree was actually signed, all of the Jews, if I remember correctly, all of the Jews were exiled just 3 months after the Alhambra Decree was signed. So this decree, which was signed to provide religious tolerance, only worked for 3 months, and then the Jews were exiled, and they were given until July the 31st of what year would that have been? Geez, let me just have a look back at, oh no, it's 1492. So 1492, July 31st, 1492, they were all told to get out of Granada, otherwise they would face, obviously, probably execution. Now here's something which is interesting about this point as well. The Ottoman army, the Ottoman navy, the Ottoman Empire had heard about what was happening to the Jews in Granada, and the Sultan Bayezid II actually sent a ship, or sent a few ships to Spain to actually help the Jews kind of get out of the land safely, and he actually took them to cities which he was kind of the king over, or the ruler over. I think he took them to Thessaloniki, which is in Greece, and some other places in Turkey. I think he took them to Izmir. Anyway, this was not kind of uncommon in Europe. Let's not forget, throughout the 13th and 16th centuries, European countries, Jews were actually expelled from various different territories. In fact, over 15 countries kicked out Jewish people for various different reasons. Spain was far from the first one to do it. England, France, and Germany and other states had already done it. Okay, and there was at least 5 other occasions where Jews were kicked out of countries after Spain. So it's, like I said, it's not uncommon. The reality of us getting a clear and accurate understanding as to why the reasons as to why the Jews were so misliked by various different peoples, I don't think we're ever really going to find out. I think they'll be lost to time forever, because much of what's left about the Jewish narrative, about people that, about the Jewish people being expelled from nations, gets edited out. But what we do see, especially when you look at the UK, we actually find out that they were kicked out for things like ritual killings and kidnappings and all of these different types of things there. So it's interesting. There's always no smoke. There's no smoke without fire. That's what them say. Here's an interesting point to be observed in recognition of the mistreatment of the Jews, funnily enough, during this medieval period of Spain, especially in Granada. Modern-day Spain have actually made a special agreement with Israel on the reparation-style citizenship, which allows automatic citizenship for Sephardic Jews, whilst the descendants of the Moors are still not recognized. And by the way, another interesting point is the fall of the Alhambra Palace is still actually celebrated every year by the City Council of Granada. Okay, and the Granada War is actually considered to be traditional Spanish historiography. Okay, so that's actually interesting. Spain as this nation, which, as we're going to find out in just a moment, when we get into it, would not be what it is today without the innovation of the Moors, actually celebrate the day that they kicked them out. But let's talk about the expulsion of the Moors. So effectively, the expulsion of the Moors, or the expulsion of the Moriscos, was an art piece which showed the port of Denia by somebody called Vincente Mostre. Let me just flick this up on the big screen so I can see it a bit better. And I'm probably going to have to just zoom in so I can see. So basically, this is the Moors being kicked out. See the name of the ship there. Look a bit of text out there, so but they're being marched out of the castles. But what we're going to talk about next is some of the kind of what's the word? Some of the things which really kind of excelled, and some of the characteristics of why Moorish rule in Al-Andalus was so successful. Now, a major part of their success, kind of assimilating with the people that they were now kind of conquering and kind of ruling effectively, and which kind of allowed them to bring their innovations into the land, was religious tolerance. Okay, what you have to remember is at this period of time, okay, religion had such a grip on the people that it was actually considered in some areas it was sinful to take a bath. Okay, remember the Dark Age was followed, well, the Moors actually brought Europe out of the Dark Age. Okay, plague scholars like somebody called Ole Benedicto estimates that around 50 million people, or 60% of Europe's population, was actually killed off by the plague. And the plague was something which was massively preventable by simple principles of hygiene. But because water was considered to be a sin, people didn't think about it. So that's how much of a grip religion had on the peoples then. But anyway, something which was introduced by the Moors, which of course helped them become so successful was religious tolerance. And basically, when they came in and they started building for everybody. They didn't just build for their own benefit and for their own good. They catered for everybody that they had, under their, or in their land. Another thing which we should take note of is, as we said, the Jews had been kicked out of so many different countries and been persecuted in so many different areas, supposedly. But the Moors accepted them. The Moors were cool with them. They were fine. In fact, the Moors actually took them under their wing to the point that they would use them as their treasurers. They would appoint them very, high-ranking positions in society. But the point that I want to move on to is, or the point that I just want to show you real quick is, you'll see this is a downtown scene. This is Alfama district in Lisbon, 1570 to 1580, and you'll just see there the mix of people. You got the Moors, you got the European pods, all mixed up. You got my brother up here on this nay, looking all official. Okay, but they won't tell you about things like this. They'll have you believe that the Moors were just simply, or African people were simply slaves at this period of time. Next thing that on this slide, okay, was this is the synagogue of Santa Maria la Blanca, a synagogue, not a mosque, which of course was predominantly where the Moors would have been found, paying homage to their deities, to their god Allah. But no, they built a synagogue because they were religiously tolerant. Next, we have the Church of San Roman Santo Tome, a church. Okay. Next, we have again another church. This is the San Miguel de Lilo. Okay, that's in Oviedo. Next, we have the Iglesia dan San Gil Abad, another church. Okay. Next, we have the Cathedral de Santa Maria what's this one? The Cathedral de Santa Maria de Medevilla. I'm not Spanish, you know what I'm saying, peeps? Forgive me. And I think the last one that we have on here is the Church of San Pedro. Okay, these are all Moorish built places of worship, and not one of them was a mosque. All of them were for the other religions that were in the area. Okay, so just wanted to kind of set the scene and help you to understand why they were able to become so successful, because they had the people's trust. They had them spiritually, so to speak. Except that they didn't spiritually conquer them, which was something that the Europeans were very effective at, as we see through the Age of Discovery. Now, the architectural influence of the Moors remains perhaps one of the most recognizable in the modern day, since it has remained largely untouched for the last several hundred years. Now, historian Mackay argues that the fact that the Mudejirs virtually monopolized the crafts associated with the building and ornamentation meant that they left their imprint on the buildings all over Christian Spain. Now, indeed, Moorish architecture can be found throughout Spain, with its slender columns, horseshoe arches, cupolas, I can't read that next one, the airy, colourful buildings. And an example of Moorish building latter altered during what's called the Reconquista is the Alcazar, which is the Palace of Seville, which is believed to date back to around the 10th century. So that's actually what you can see there at the bottom. That's the Alcazar of Seville. I mean, to be honest as well, I'm not sure if I've already mentioned this, but the architecture of Spain and Portugal is probably one of the main reasons why people from outside of Europe actually come to Spain and Portugal. These next two images here are of the Great Mosque, these are of the Alcazar. They're the gardens in the back. That's another shot. This next one is of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, aka the La Mezquita, and it is still one of the architectural wonders of the world in spite of the latter Spanish disfigurements. Its low scarlet and gold roof supported by over 1,000 columns, which are made of marble, jasper, and another material, and it was lit by thousands of brass and silver lamps which burned perfumed oils. Okay, so in the 10th century, yeah, that's fire. That's an architectural magnificence. Now, in the 10th century, Cordoba was not only the capital of Al-Andalus, but it was also one of the most significant cities and important cities in the world, which actually rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople for its academic prowess. It boasted a population of over 500,000 people, which is 200,000 more than there are now. It had street lighting. There were over 50 hospitals. There were running water. There was 300 public baths. There was 500 mosques, over 70 libraries, which held over 500,000 books respectively. And the Moorish achievement in hydraulic engineering was actually outstanding. They constructed an aqueduct which conveyed water from the mountains all of the way to through the city through lead pipes. Okay, now all of this was done at a period of time when London was largely illiterate, with a population of around 20,000 people, and had forgotten the technical advances that the Romans had actually brought to them about 600 years before. So they had paved lighting, and streetlights did not appear in Paris and London for at least another 100 years, until around 1100, 1200 CE. Now the other things that we can see, okay, these are the columns that we were talking about underneath the Mosque of Cordoba. This is the Castle de Moros. This is the Castle of Gibraltar. This is the castle at Lorca. This is the Alhambra. Now, some other innovations that were brought through by the Moors were scientific techniques such as the astrolabe, which was a device for measuring the position of the stars and the planets. Scientific progress in astronomy, chemistry, physics, mathematics, geography, and philosophy flourished during Moorish control of Spain. Now, this is because education was universal in Moorish Spain. It was available to all, while in Christian Europe 99% of the population, as we mentioned, were illiterate, and even the kings could neither read or write. Now at this period of time in Europe, again, they only had 2 universities, while the Moors had 17 great universities, which were located in places like Almeria, Cordoba, Granada, Jaén, Malaga, Seville, and Toledo. This first image that we can see is actually Salamanca University. This next one is the Cordoba University, and this one again, by mistake, is the Alhambra, which is in Granada. So yes, the Granada. Now, in the 10th and 11th centuries, public libraries in Europe, as we mentioned, were pretty much non-existent, while the Moors were boasting over 70 of them. There was a library in Cordoba which boasted over having over 600,000 manuscripts. Okay, so you know that these guys were not playing no games. Agriculture and trade. Now, this is a very, very important point, because a lot of what the Moors introduced during their kind of reign and occupation of Al-Andalus is what keeps Spain and Portugal economically buoyant today. So you have to remember, the Moors were from North Africa, and not only were they intimately connected with the Saharan, the West, the East, the Central African, and the Arab East trade. Yeah, they were highly connected already. And for thousands of years, North Africans had already been in consistent control of the Mediterranean Sea, which allowed them to monopolize trade. So they had their own economy before Al-Andalus. Now, the Moors actually introduced many new crops into Hispaniola, including the orange, the lemon, the peach, apricot, fig, sugarcane, dates, ginger, pomegranate, saffron, sugarcane, cotton, rice, and a lot of these, as we said, are still staple products of their economy today. So if it wasn't for the introduction that the Moors provided them, they would be, well, who knows where they would be today. Language. Now, this is often overlooked, and it is often assumed that Spanish or Espanol derives from Latin alone. Okay, but closer inspection into the language and into the word actually reveal its Arabic roots. There are more than 8,000 words of Arabic origin or in use in modern Spanish today. Examples include words beginning with al, such as algebra, Allah, and other words relating to scientific or mathematical knowledge, as well as exotic words like azuga, which is sugar. Place names such as Calatayud, which is Kal at Ayub. We have Madrid, which was Majiri, and Andalusia, which was Al-Andalus, and Alcantara, which was Alcantara. So other examples, let me just see. Other examples would be things like barrio, which comes from the Arabic word bari, or maybe I'm pronouncing that incorrect, but that means neighborhood. Another one in Spanish would be jara, which comes from the Arabic word gara, which I believe is for the jar or the mug. There is alfombra, which is a carpet or a rug, and in Arabic it is al-khanbal. So it's very, very similar. One person who we just have to touch on and we have to bring a little mention to is Abu I Hassan Ali ibn Nafi, okay, from circa 789 CE. He was a singer, an oud player, a composer, a poet, and a teacher who lived and worked in Iraq, North Africa, and later in Al-Andalusia, okay, and he was the Don of the medieval Moorish Empire, period, if we want to call it that. Okay, he was known as a polymath, okay, with knowledge in astronomy, geography, meteorology, botanics, cosmetics, culinary arts, and fashion. And his nickname was Ziryab, which meant the blackbird. Okay, he was also known as the Pajero Negro, which of course means blackbird in Spanish. But he created deodorant to eliminate bad odors. He promoted morning and evening baths. He emphasized the maintenance of personal hygiene. Blackbird was also believed to have invented the early concept for toothpaste, which he popularized throughout Iberia. He made it fashionable for shaving amongst men. Okay, he's created like a new set of haircuts. Royalty used to wash their hair with rose water, but Blackbird introduced salt and fragrance oils to help improve hair condition. Ziryab was a gastronome. Okay, he was an extraordinaire, and he revolutionized all this. He revolutionized the way people ate. Okay, he actually invented the multi-course meal, or he was the first to kind of popularize it. He started, with the start, the main, and the dessert. So we started with things like soups, then the entree, and then ending with a dessert, which rapidly picked off, okay, and then it spread all throughout Europe, and it's something that we still utilize today. It is rumored that he knew over 10,000 songs by heart, and he was the finest musician and singer of his day. Okay, he introduced passionate songs, music, and dances from the east into the Iberian Peninsula, which actually goes on to influence gypsy music, which again evolves into the flamenco, which is traditional Spanish music today. So it is all down to this black African brother that we can see down Yasser. So touching on some other characters that we see from this from Europe, who we know are provably from Black African origin, we have Emperor Lucius Septimus Severus from circa 145 CE to 211 CE. He was a Roman emperor of Libyan descent, from Lipsus Magna, rising through the ranks of esteem. He actually served under the previous ruler. Securing the loyalty of over 16 different legions of the Rhine and the Danube to his cause, Septimus actually marched into Italy and was recognized as the emperor by the Senate in 193 CE without actually having to kind of swing the sword. And that was known as the year of the five emperors, because he was up against obviously four other people who were trying to bid for the emperorship of the Roman Empire. In 208 CE, a small-scale fighting actually broke out in the frontier of Roman Britain, and actually gave Severus the excuse to actually launch a campaign into Britain, which would actually last until his death in 211 CE. Severus was actually responsible for completely repairing and renovating many forts along what's known as Hadrian's Wall, and this was all with the intentions of actually providing a good headquarters and base to actually conquer the entire British Isle. Um, who else do we have? Yeah. Next one is Queen Philippa. Now she's interesting because recently we've heard a lot of talk and a lot of information about Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz being, of course, the first black queen of England. You know, just to set the record straight, that's not correct. The first one that we have on record is Queen Philippa. She was born 1314 CE and died circa 1369 CE. Now, Queen Philippa, as I said, is England's first known black queen. She was the daughter of William III of Hainault, which is modern-day Belgium. And due to what's known as iconoclasm, which is the systematic whitewashing of images, especially historical images, they actually depict her as any old Maid Marian, looking like she could have rolled around with your brother Robin Hood. Okay. However, written accounts that describe the young princess before she actually left her homeland state emphatically that the lady of whom we saw has not uncomely hair, betwixt blue and black, brown, and her head and her forehead high and standing somewhat forward. Her eyes are blackish brown and deep, her nose is fairly smooth and even, save that it is somewhat broad at the tip and somewhat flattened, yet it is no snub nose. Her nostrils are also broad, and her mouth is fairly wide, her lips are somewhat full, and especially her lower lip. Moreover, she is brown of skin all over, and much like her father, in all things pleasant enough, as it seems to us. Now that was written by the entourage of the English king, who was betrothed or was looking for obviously a wife. They went on to become married. They actually had 14 children, and the oldest of their children was actually known to history as the Black Priest. And speaking of the Black Prince, here he is, Edward the Black Prince. He was the eldest of these, eldest son of Edward III of England and Philippa of Hainault, and he participated in the early years of what's known as the 100 Years' War. He died before his father, so he never actually became king, and he fought many historic battles where he was always depicted as the hero, and he was involved in battles such as Crecy, Cheshire, Calais, and Aquitaine. What's also interesting again is, although we know that he would have been a relatively mixed brother, he's been iconoclassified as well. He's been whitewashed out there. Oh. Next one, let's get a biblical on them for a hot second. We have Apostle Nicanor, the deacon of the 70. Okay, Saint Nicanor was named in the Acts of the Holy Apostles, chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, along with other characters like Prochorus, Timon, Parmenas, and Saint Stephen and Philip the Evangelist, to be amongst the first 7 deacons of the Church of Christ around 70 CE. Now, all of these characters were martyred on different dates. Nicanor was actually stoned to death by a mob on the 27th of December, and they are all celebrated on the same day, on the 28th of December. Oh, here she is. Brother, now the timeline on this presentation is not the best, of course. We have Queen Charlotte of Sophia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She was the 8th child, okay, of Charles Louis Frederick and Albertine of Saxon-Hildesberg, and that actually made her a direct descendant of the Afro-Portuguese royal house, the Margarida de Castro y Sousa. King George III and her were married when she was just 17, making her the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. One of their sons, Edward Augustus, was the father of Queen Victoria. Now, Charlotte was certainly a queen of the people. For those who don't know, she founded the first and longest standing maternity care institute to help improve British birth rate. She was also the queen who introduced the Christmas tree. It is well recorded fact that she was a big fan of classical music, and she actually requested that the 8-year-old Beethoven dedicate her his Opus 3 piece to her, and she required him to play at a private party. She died in 1818 CE after 57 years and 70 days as the queen, which is the longest queen consort still to this day. Next, we have Pope Saint Victor I. Okay, he was the 15th and first African Pope. Victor I was of Berber origin. He was supposedly born of modern-day Libya, and he reigned from circa 186 CE to 196
1507 CE. It was Pope Victor's decision when to celebrate Easter. He was the guy who made that decision in conclusion to what is known as the Easter controversy. Okay, because for those who don't know, the Easter controversy, basically the Christians at Rome who had come from the province of Asia were accustomed to observe Easter on the 14th day of what's known as Nisan, whichever day of the week that would fall on. Okay, now that was their tradition. Now Pope Victor decided before actually to actually bring unity amongst kind of Christendom, that the Easter festival would be celebrated on a specific day, and there was a massive resistance to this because obviously people would have to drop their traditions, and this kind of conflict stretched all throughout Christendom, from Rome to Asia to other parts of Europe, and basically people were threatened with excommunication, and it took a while for the kind of acceptance to come around. But it was because of his decision that Easter is kind of celebrated on the day that it is. Pope Victor is also the Pope who is first recognized to write in Latin. So he started writing in writing theology in Latin. He was the first one to do that officially. Next, we've got Abba Moses, the robber saint. Okay, he was a big, powerful man, also called the Ethiopian. He was an escaped slave of an Hellenized Egyptian official, and he became the leader of a 75-member deep gang of bandits who terrorized the Nile Valley. Now, after an encounter and some time spent with a monastery, that actually prompted and promoted him to change his ways. He went on to be a very proven spiritual leader as per the text, and he was very effective, and he actually established his own monastery, again of 75 people who actually practiced non-violence all throughout the Western Desert. Now he was martyred at the age of 75 under the attack of Berbers, and of course for that he became a saint. Next we have Saint Benedict the Black, circa 1526. Saint Benedict was born in 1526 to an enslaved African in Sicily who was captured supposedly at the start of the 16th century and was granted freedom for his parents' hard work. Now, because of his appearance, Benedict was also called Il Moro, Ethiops, or Niger. Okay, not because of his origin, but because of his skin. And at the age of 21, he was racially abused, and he ignored it with grace. That was noticed by the leader of a spiritual community, a hermit community, and they kind of, actually accepted him into the group. And after 7 years or so of him being in the group, he actually succeeded the leader of the group at 28 and went on to lead them, into all different types of, new highs for this spiritual group. Interestingly enough, with Saint Benedict, Pope Pius IV made a decree in 1564 CE to actually disband all religious hermit groups which had gained in influence throughout the regions, because they were kind of dislodging people's kind of faith and reliance in the Vatican. So he kind of split them up, and he made sure that all of those hermit groups would attach themselves to a Christian monastery. So Benedict actually attached himself to the Order of Friars Minor, which was posted to the Franciscan Friary of St. Mary of Jesus in Palermo. He began in the kitchen and quickly became renowned for his depth in spirituality, wisdom, theology, and scriptures, and he worked his way up through the hierarchy and was actually elected to become the guardian of the community. Now, his strict practice of the faith was observed, revered, and actually helped shape the future of that strain of the religion and how that was practiced. Now, he was beatified by Pope Benedict the 14th, I believe, in 1743 CE, and he was canonized in 1807 CE by Pope Pius. Now, ironically and insultingly enough, he is assumed to be the patron of African Americans, okay, because of his spiritual pacification. He was happy to turn the other cheek when black people were being beasted on. Okay, so it's just funny the way that religion is happy to set this up. He has nothing to do with African Americans, however, they'll happily call him his patron saint. Next, we have Al-Chitrof, okay, the Emperor of Ethiopia, circa 1580 CE. This painting is actually housed in the Uffizi Gallery of Florence and was painted by a renowned replica specialist, Cristofano dell'Altissimo, who actually went on to make over 280 reproductions of contemporary and classic poets, rulers, dignitaries, and scholars, all for Cosimo de' Medici. Now, the Europeanized name is not easily associated with a known Ethiopian king. Okay, the Uffizi Museum Infantry of 1784 CE actually lists this portrait Dawit II, followed by this painting, and Dawit's successor is known as somebody called Claudius Asnaf Sagnad, aka Emperor Galweldros, of 1521 to 1559 CE, who ruled for around 19 years and died in 1559. And this is the same year that this painting was commissioned, so we have very good grounds to accept and understand that this is Emperor Galweldros of Ethiopia. So the next two, or the next characters that we're going to deal with in history, don't necessarily hail from Hispaniola or in Europe, but it's because of the importance. And so the next people that we're going to deal with is Don Francesco di Arobe and his sons Don Domingo and Don Pedro. The historical narrative indicates that Don Francesco and his sons were of wealth and notability in Esmeralda, which is in Ecuador, which was largely a vassal state under the control of the Spanish. Now, their style indicates both Iberian and Al-Andalusian influence, so you can see with like the gold plates and the stuff in their nose and in their ears, that's got the Ecuadorian, South American influence, and then you can see with the garments that they're wearing that they can, it comes out that Iberian and Al-Andalusian style. Don, by the way, is a title which is still used to this day as a title of respect all throughout South America. The painter's inscription on the right hand side in the white bit, in the white bit, says Dr. Juan del Barrio de Sepulveda, or Sepulveda. So the next people that we're gonna deal with. Next up is Don Francesco di Arobe and his two sons, Don Domingo and Don Pedro. The historical narrative indicates that Don Francesco and his sons were of wealth and notability and notoriety in Esmeralda, which is in Ecuador, which was a vassal state under the control of the Spanish. Now, their style indicates in the painting that they had both Iberian or Al-Andalusian style and also native South American swag. You can tell with like the nose pieces and the ear pieces, like the gold, and then obviously the garments you can see with the European influence that we're wearing or holding their little hats. The painter's inscription, which is on the right in the white, actually says Dr. Juan del Barrio de Sepulveda, judge of the Real Andalusia or Audiencia of Quito, commissioned and paid for the painting for your majesty, or for Majesty Philip, the Catholic King of Spain and the Indies, in the year 1599. Now, Esmeralda has historically always been the headquarters of kind of African rebellion in South America. The documented history of Ecuador establishes the beginnings of Afro-Hispanic culture in Esmeraldas, where a Spanish slaving ship actually crashed around 1553. There was a group of around 23 Africans from the coast of Guinea who were led by a warrior named Anton, who attacked the slavers and actually liberated themselves. And not long after, this group, together with other blacks entering into the region led by somebody called Ladino and also someone called Alonso de Illescas, came to actually dominate the region from northern Manabi all the way up to what is now the Barbacoas and Colombia. And at this time, the late 16th century, intermixture with the indigenous people, with the new entering African people, actually led people to go on to build palanques, which were kind of like villages of self-defense, and this was kind of occupied. These were occupied by liberated peoples. This were This brought on, this admixture, by the way, created an ethnic group or an ethnic category called Zambos, which is ultimately a mix of the indigenous American people with the incoming or newcoming African people. And by 1599, black people were clearly in charge of what was called the La Republique des Zambos, or the Zambo Republic. And Zambo, as I said, refers to the people of descendants of Native Americans and Africans who were coming in. Now, in that year, 1599, the Zambo chieftains, who were said to represent around 100,000 or more Zambo people of Esmeralda, actually trekked into Quito to actually declare loyalty to Spain. So, of course, they fell under the boot there. But ultimately, interestingly enough, today, to this point in South America, Esmeralda actually does remain the highest concentration of black African people in Ecuador, with the majority of the population around 70%. The next person we're going to deal with is Don Antonio Manuel Nsuka Nvunda. Okay, and before we actually get into this, I just want to point out that despite what Eurocentric historians provide to us in general history, the Kingdom of the Congo in the 15th century, which resided, in modern-day Angola, was a very powerful state. It was headquartered by a place, or the capital was a place called Mbanza, Congo, and Catholic missionaries landed in the region at about 1490, and in the following year, the Nzinga Mkulu, who was the king of Congo, was actually christened, and he changed his name to Nduo Nzulu. However, the Portuguese tutor will soon move towards more kind of sinister interests, such as the slave trade, the gold industry, the ivory industry, and the missionaries in general actually start to expand because of their pursuit into commerce and basically slave trade. Anyway, Don Antonio Manuel Nsuka Nvunda. He is considered to be the first African ambassador to Rome on duty. After near a century of this Portuguese colonial pressure, the Mani Congo, the king of Congo, Alvaro II, Nimi and Nkonga, he grew tired of the continual infringements on the Congo sovereignty, and he actually tasked Nvunda with traveling and negotiating with the Pope to actually try to get him to ease off and provide some type of kind of relief. Nvunda traveled through Brazil and to Spain for over 4 years, arriving in Rome on January the 3rd, 1608, where he fell ill and died after just 2 to 3 days. And the reason why Europeans love him so much is because the Pope actually pays special attention to him and actually visits him in person on the 6th before he dies. Next person we're going to touch on real quick is Mully Ahmed of circa 1534 CE. Mully Ahmed was a Berber king of Tunis who was reinstated onto the throne after the conquest of Charles V. Signs of war can actually be seen in the background of this picture. It was painted by somebody called Vermeyen, who portrayed the prince himself with a noble air, holding the sword in his right hand, and in his upper right corner he added the royal coat of arms with an Arabic inscription which says there is only one God, Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Rubens would actually go on to later use Mully Ahmed's profile to paint an iconic Renaissance piece which is called the Adoration of the Magi. In 1534 or 1535, Jean Corlenis, the name, as I said, repainted the original painting. And the second piece was actually painted by Rubens in 1640 CE, of course, many years after Ahmed's death. And apparently now the original is lost, but this was meant to have been found in Rubens' personal collection. Next we have Dorothea of Denmark, the Duchess of Perugia, circa 1525 CE. Those who don't know, Perugia is the historical region in Europe which was headquartered in Königsberg, which is modern-day Germany, and it stretched from Poland through Russia, Lithuania, Denmark, Belgium, and even the Czech Republic. But she was the daughter of King Frederick of Denmark and Anna of Brandenburg, and she became the Duchess of Perugia through marriage to Albert, the Duke of Perugia, and she held an ambassadorial type position, keeping relations smooth between Denmark and Perugia. Next, we're going to talk about Abraham Petrovich Ganable from 1696 to 1781 CE. He was kidnapped by invading Turks from a place called Lagone Birni, which is territory in the Kotoko Kingdom. At a very young age, he was taken to Constantinople and he was put into service in the home of Sultan Ahmed III. Now, modern day scholarship actually suggests that he was from northern Cameroon, and that the information was incorrect, that he was from the Kotoko region. Now, in 1704 CE, a Russian ambassador was on the hunt for treasures for the Tsar Peter the Great, who took a very special interest and very special liking in him, and actually took Abraham as his godchild through baptism and set him on the path for military education. Now, basically what had happened is when the Tsar had died, the heir disliked Ganable, okay, because of how much the Tsar liked him, and he was actually exiled. Now, upon return from exile in 1742 to 1752, actually rose through the ranks to Major General, becoming a highly revered character amongst society for his military mind. Now, in his second marriage, he had 10 children. His eldest son was Ivan Rose. His second son, Ivan, rose to the second highest rank in Imperial Russian history. Another one of his sons, Oslip, was the father of Nadzida, who was the mother of the famed Russian literature author Alexander Pushkin, who we will be talking about in just a moment. Peter actually died, Ganable spread his seed and put his seed out there, like we said, okay. But there's quite a few British aristocrats who actually descend from Ganable, including Natalie Grosvenor, who is the Duchess of Winchester. There is her sister Alexandra Hamilton, who is the Duchess of Abercrombie. There is George Mountbatten. There is also others as well, but you know what? They ain't even important people. The next person we're gonna deal with is one of my favorite people in history, because I am a classical music fan, and for a very long time I thought that this was something that only Europeans did. However, finding this brother here, Joseph Boulon Chevalier de Saint Georges, my love for classical music has only been maximized. So he, to me, is a worthy example of black excellence in motion. He was a champion fencer, he was a virtuoso violinist and a conductor, and a leading symphony orchestra of Paris. Now, he was born to Anne Nanon, who was an African under the ownership of Georges Boulon de Saint Georges, who was a self-made planter. So basically he was a slave owner, there's no two ways about it. And he was from Guadeloupe, and he was actually sent to France at a very young age, and he actually graduated at the age of 20. When he was made into a knight or a chevalier, to which of course he adopted into his title just like his father. And it was to his contemporaries' surprise that he was an accomplished violinist, and actually took around 2 to 3 years to actually become a concert master. But because he was enrolled into this Parisian school, racism was about. He learned fencing, he learned horsemanship, he studied under somebody called Tessier de la Bossière, who was a champion fencer. According to Bossier's son, Joseph becomes so advanced with the sword so quickly that he became the best swordsman by 15, and he was called the God of Arms by 19. He became politically activated at the age of 19, when a rival fencer from a different school called him a mulatto in a very public and a demeaning way. And Joseph challenged him to a duel, which was witnessed publicly. And this crowd was said to be split in opinion with the opinion on African slavery. Some were for it. They were like, yeah, boom, keep these Negroes enslaved. and others were like, no, it's not right, they have rights, right, and they were righteous. And basically Joseph absolutely terrorized his rival. He made him look like a fool. He did a little bit like what Jesse Owens did at the Olympics in front of Hitler, but obviously years before. But anyway, Joseph, as I said, became this concert master, and he wrote music and orchestrated performances that critics called the best performances in Paris, possibly Europe. And he even had the opportunity to perform alongside Maria Antoinette, who was the last queen of France before the revolution. Basically, Joseph had been put forth for one of the highest positions in music in Paris, and racist petitioners obviously objectified against this, and he actually ended up just withdrawing his application. And then Marie Antoinette actually just personally invited him to become her tutor. So he kind of leveled up. However, personally, it would have been savage if he just stuck by his guns. Now, people are often disrespectfully placing shade on Joseph by calling him the Black Mozart, when in reality the situation is Joseph was actually an inspiration to Mozart. They both lived within the same period of time, albeit they lived in different places. Mozart actually based some of his passages in his ballet score, which was called Les Petits Reins, which means, I think, if I remember correctly, the little everything or the little nothing. And that's one of Joseph's compositions. Not to mention, okay, Joseph was 11 years Mozart's senior. So if anything, if we're being technical here, Mozart should actually be known as the White Chevalier to St. George's, not the other way around. Now, another dope thing about him, and we could talk about his triumphs, you know, all day, but another one of his things is Joseph actually coloneled an all-black regiment that fought in the Republic of the French Revolution, and he controlled 1,000 men, and one of his lieutenant colonels was Thomas Alexandre Dumas, who was the father of Alexandre Dumas, who was the famous French literician, that's not a word, the famous French author who wrote The Three Musketeers. So next, naturally, we have to talk about General Thomas Alexandre Dumas of 1672 to 1806 CE. After holding command under Chevalier, Dumas actually continued to rise through the ranks and rose to general in the Revolutionary Army. And he became the highest ranking man of African descent to ever obviously control a European army. And he was the first person of color in the French military to become a brigadier general. He was the first to become a divisional general, and he was also the first to become a general-in-chief in the French army. He had such a military tactical expertise that he caused the Allied soldiers to nickname him the Schwarzer Teufel, which was the Black Devil, or the Diable Noir in French. Dumas was in command of the cavalry forces on Napoleon's attempt to conquer Egypt and the Levant, and Dumas and Napoleon actually clashed on their ethical, principles. And it actually caused Dumas to literally just turn around and kind of cancel his kind of dealings with Napoleon. When he'd actually, when he actually returned to France, he ended up having a wife and a son who would actually go on to be, as we said, one of the country's most famous playwrights and authors, the son of the same name, Alexandre Dumas. Next, we'll deal with his son, Alexandre Dumas, 1802 to 1870 CE. He was the son of the famed general Thomas Alexandre Dumas, and of course, he had to go about there to carve out his own legacy. Now, his works have been translated into over 100 languages, making him one of the most read French authors of all time. He frequently wrote travel books and different magazine articles, and ended up with over 100,000 pages published. Pardon me, that's powers. His novels today, to this very day, are still being adapted for the big screen. There are nearly 200 films based off his work. Dumas's last novel, which was called The of Saint Germain was an unfinished work at his death, which was later completed by a scholar called Claude Schlupp, who published his work in 2005, and it was the film called The Last Cavalier. But Dumas based some of his characters and stories on his dad. His most known works, of course, are the Count of Monte Cristo. There was the Three Musketeers. There were 20 Years After, and the Vicomte of, I can't even pronounce that one. Sorry. Who we got to deal with next? Next, we have Saint Maurice. Maurice is has ancestral origins which are difficult to trace, but it's said that he was born in Waset, which is Thebes, which is in Egypt, and he rose through the ranks in the Roman army and took command of an all-Christian legion. Now, upon orders by Emperor Maximium, or Maximium, should I say, his legion was to deploy to Mount Blanc to assist in the settling of a rebellion, and Maurice was given orders which went against his faith, and Maximian ordered what was known as 2 decimations of his legion, and eventually the slaughter of the entire legion when he refused to hassle a group of innocent Christians that were occupying the town that they just sacked. Now, the term decimation, for those who don't know, has its origins in the Roman military punishment, which would basically see every 10th soldier killed. Okay, Maurice is venerated in many different ways throughout Europe as a patron saint. In fact, there are over 600, if not 650, religious institutes that bear the name of Saint Maurice. He has become the patron saint of brotherhood. He is a historical figure. I can't. What was the phrase? He was a historical. All throughout Germany, he's massively revered. That's one thing that I can remember off the top of my head, and I think what I was trying to get at is that he was the patron saint of the Brotherhood of the Blackheads, which is a historically active military order, which is in somewhere in East Europe. I think it's like Latvia or Estonia. But Saint Maurice was loved, and you can tell just by the depiction that we can see on the screen, they weren't playing if this is the image that they chose to remember him by. Here's another image of him. The oldest remaining statue that actually remains in his likeness is this 13th century statue of Saint Maurice, which is in Magdeburg in Germany. Next person we're going to deal with is Don Miguel de Castro, who was an emissary of Congo. He was sent with an entourage by a ruler of Sonjo in 1643 CE or 1644, and he arrived to the Netherlands via Brazil. And the purpose of the trip was to actually partly resolve an internal conflict in the Congo, which was caused by Christian-led slave traders who were doing all of that divide and conquering, which they are, of course, ever so good at. Now, what we have to remember is that Portugal Christianized the Congo. Okay, so they were all about this. You see his attire there? He was all about that. You could see here the other images. This is Pedro Sunda and Diego Bemba. These were part of the entourage. Next person we're going to deal with is Jan Vos of 1610 to 1667. He was a Dutch poet living in Amsterdam who brought one of the country's most renowned playwrights and one of the country's most renowned playwrights and poets. And he was entrusted with the responsibilities of organizing and designing the city's celebrations and pageants. Now, his poetry became highly sought after with native noble families who befriended him just for his talents. Jan Vos was the head of what's known as the Theater Van Kampen for 19 years. So he's a very important social figure. The sister we're going to deal with now is Louise Marie, 1664 to 1732 CE. She was called the Maurice or the Maresse de Moret, or the Mores of Moret. And she was the mulatto daughter of Maria Theresa, who was the Queen of France. There is an indisputable record of her birth in the diary of Mademoiselle de Montpensier, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and that is the king's first cousin. And she said that the child that the queen had just given birth to resembled the little dwarf that Mademoiselle de Beaufort had brought from a foreign country, that was well formed in his race of dwarf and negro, and that the child did not seem that it would live. And that is straight out of the diary. Now, Voltaire declared that he visited the convent where this girl was imprisoned, and that he saw her, and her picture hangs in the or maybe even the library of Saint Genevieve in Paris. So basically, the queen was sleeping around, and she got caught slipping. This next character here is known as Joseph Cinque, but we as African people know him as Sengbe. He was kidnapped at a young age from Sierra Leone, and he was held captive on slave ships and in Cuba to be sold as a means for free labor. And he was bound for sugar plantations. Now, Sengbe actually led a revolt on board what's known as the La Amistad, that went on to obviously be led to freedom, or led to the freedom of over 100 African captives. The captain of the ship and a few others were killed, and the Spanish slave owners Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes were actually spared on the condition that they would steer the ship back to Sierra Leone. Naturally, the Europeans, the Spaniards, deceived them and actually directed them back to the US, and the Africans were arrested and charged with mutiny and murder. However, once a Mendator English translator was found, Sengbe was actually unable to obviously present the jury with the information, and they were later on freed. Because of course they were captured illegally by African slave traders in 1839 and sold to Pedro Blanco. Of course, that's a narrative which we have to accept. We don't know if that's necessarily the truth, but they were imprisoned on the Portuguese slave ship, which was called the Tacora, and it was in violation of various different treaties which were prohibiting the international slave trade at this period of time. And Cinque was actually taken to Cuba, as we said, to be sold with around 110 other African people by the Spaniards Jose Ruiz and what's his name, Pedro Montes. So yes, he actually appears on the $5,000 banknote in Sierra Leone, and he actually got back home to his homeland in 1842. Next, we have Dr. Melchior Adam Weikart. He was a German physician and philosopher in the time of Enlightenment, and at a very young age, he was involved in a very serious incident which left him with a hunchback. He studied medicine and received his doctorate in 1764. He went on and settled down as a doctor, and then successively ascended into the Hofrat, which was the personal physician of the Prince Bishop and the professor of the medicine in Faluda University, which is in Adolfina. He was appointed the court physician of the Russian Tsarina Catherine II at the Tsar's court in St. Petersburg, and he was then appointed the state councillor in 1785, and he was active up until his death in 1789. He actually also published over 22 works, if I remember rightly, yeah, I think he was a Freemason. But of course, as with most black Freemasons, they don't ever actually attain any real position of notability. Next is John VI of Portugal. Okay, he ruled from he was alive from 1767 to 1826 CE. He was the dark mulatto, and he was the maker of modern Brazil. He actually transferred his throne from Portugal all the way over to Rio de Janeiro in 1808 CE, and he ruled Portugal from Brazil. And this is the only time that a European country has ever been ruled by an American one. Next, we have Pedro I, who was the Emperor of Brazil in 1822. Pedro married the sister of Napoleon's second wife, Gloria, Pedro's daughter became Queen of Portugal and was the sister-in-law of Victoria, Queen of England, and many members of the European royalty actually traced their ancestry to the Negro ruler John the Fourth, who is this brother. Oh, sorry, John the Sixth, which is this brother. This is John Westmoreland. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but this one was one that actually shocked me when I was doing the research for the presentation. The accurate backstory of John's origins, of course, have been lost to time, but the narrative available was written by a descendant of a contemporary resident to John. And the narrative insists that John, whom was taken from Africa, who first went to London, was then taken to Wales by the Wynn family between the ages of 8 and 10. Now, he became fluent in Welsh and English and lived in rural Wales. From the narrative, he was very sought after by many of the local women, and he married and had a son by the same name who went on to live in the local area and is said to still have relatives living there today. Yeah, so I mean, it's not that massive history, that one, but to me, I thought that that was a bit of a madness. I was like, raw, we've got a black brother in Wales in the 1800s. Okay. So that is the oversimplified Moorish Renaissance, the Reconquista, and some, notable characters of European history. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your focus. You already don't know I appreciate your time. Okay, please go out there and support the launch of the new book, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. 50% of the profits will be donated to We Will Rise Together and any ongoing projects which I'm involved with going forward. So yes, peace, powers, love. I'll catch you real soon. Uncle Joss and Neb. She'em Hotep, all of that goodness there.